Lots to cover. First, some news. Not everything is slowing down in the midst of the coronavirus. In recent days, Pope Francis has initiated a new commission to study female deacons, and he's calling for a universal basic wage. Just as Cardinal George Pell has reemerged after Australia's High Court unanimously acquitted him of crimes of sexual abuse. Joining me now with an in-depth analysis of all these stories and more is the Papal Posse at home, or perhaps we're now the Pandemic Posse, Editor-in-Chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father GERALD Murray. Thank you both for being with us. Gents, this past Tuesday, Cardinal Pell, in his first interview, was asked if he thought there was an anti-Catholic bias at work in the decision of police to charge him and by judges at the Victoria Court of Appeal to sustain his conviction, despite the evidence which eventually led to his exoneration. Here's how Cardinal George Pell explained it.
The culture wars are real. There is a systematic attempt to remove the Judeo-Christian legal foundations, well, the examples of marriage, life, gender, sex. Unfortunately, there's less rational discussion, and there's more playing the man, more abuse and intimidation, and that's not good for a democracy.
To what do you attribute that answer? What do you make of it? And how big a role do you think bias against the Catholic Church played in Pell's case and the way it proceeded? Father Jerry Murray.
I think it's clear, Raymond, there was a hostile and prejudicial attitude toward both Cardinal Pell and the Church in general, and that the police used means that they, I think, have not used in other cases. This was called historical sexual abuse. It was based on one witness. There were not a lot of other witnesses who were brought forward. The case, of course, had a tortured and tangled history in the Australian court system. There was a hung jury, then there was the jury that found him guilty, and then on the Victoria Court of Appeals, it was a 2-to-1 decision against Pell, but the dissenting opinion absolutely destroyed any prosecution case, and then that dissenting opinion, of course, is what was vindicated in the High Court's decision. Now, all of this points to a problem of secularization, which is people who reject the Judeo-Christian worldview and the legal and customs that go along with it, they're not content to just leave people who uphold it on the sidelines. They basically want to wipe out any memory or presence of a solid, natural law-based Christian, Judeo-Christian outlook. And I think this is very manifest in trying to go after central figures of Catholicism. I think Cardinal Pell was in their line of fire. Fortunately, he got out because the system still has integrity at the highest level.
Robert Royal, there's no doubt the Church in Australia mishandled these sex abuse cases as they have in the past. And one gets a feeling it was that upsetment that led to the Pell conviction. I mean, look, we're still waiting for the McCarrick report to come out. So there's plenty of justice to be doled out here.
Yeah, but I think one of the other factors that we ought to take into account is how biased the media were in Australia. And in particular, what's called the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which, like other media outlets that are supported by taxpayer dollars, was really a propaganda arm. And we see this in the United States with NPR and PBS, the BBC in England. There tends to be a radicalization of those particular state-run media. And so there was pressure across the board that exacerbated already an existing anger, in some instances a justified anger about the way the Church held these things. I think another feature that the Cardinal alluded to in that wonderful interview with this journalist Bolt, which I think all of our viewers ought to also look at, it's about a half hour, 45 minutes, is he talked about how certain figures in Rome who care about him and care about the corruption and the financial side of the Vatican.
Yeah, well, Bob, you're getting ahead of me here.
Some connection.
Hold on, Bob. He was asked at one point if he thought the corruption that he, Cardinal Pell, exposed as head of the Financial Secretariat at the Vatican was related to the troubles he faced in Australia. He said this.
Most of the senior people in Rome who are in any way sympathetic to financial reform believe that they are. There's a flurry of articles just before Christmas and around Christmas exposing all sorts of things, like a disastrous purchase, actually a couple of them, in London. And it was very clearly demonstrated that we tenaciously opposed those things.
Bob, what do you make of that answer and that him linking the corruption that he discovered in the Vatican to these fraudulent charges of sexual abuse he faced in Australia?
Look, I'm not usually given to conspiracy theories, but there has been some speculation that the mafia connections between Italy and Eastern Australia are rather strong. It may be surprising to some people to find this out, but there is an Italian-style mob in Eastern Australia. And the reason why there may be some credibility to this connection, because there's long been this connection that people speculate between the mafia and at the Vatican Bank. Of course, The Godfather 3, in a kind of a humorous way, I used to think, had connected those two, and I thought it was a very bad movie for that reason. It now seems to be somewhat realistic. And I think that the reason why the connection is somewhat plausible is, why did the police push this case so hard, the Pell case? Why did the prosecutors push a case for which there was no corroborating evidence? When we talk about evidence now, we really are saying there is no evidence other than this one person who is charged that he did this in very impossible circumstances. So a state prosecutor and the police decided to go ahead with a prosecution that in most other jurisdictions would have just been dismissed as utterly without foundation.
Father Jerry, were you surprised by what I considered a revelation in this interview? It didn't get any pickup, where Cardinal Pell said he had backup documents hidden abroad, and he worried about his staff's safety at the Vatican when he was investigating all these financial misdeeds.
Well, the Cardinal wouldn't say that if he didn't intend seriously for it to be known. I mean, he wants that to be known precisely because when you're dealing with money and corruption, as we've seen in the Vatican and Europe in a wider sense, there are problems. And there are things that need to be explained. That real estate purchase in London, the fraudulent turning money away from a hospital to pay for another hospital, and maybe to cover the Vatican debt in this matter. These things have been well explored, but on the side of the Vatican, I don't think a convincing explanation has been given yet. This reminds me that you mentioned the McCarrick report. We were told that was already in December. It's now April. When will that come out? I think certainly to clear the deck here, the Vatican has to vindicate Cardinal Pell and say that these charges have now been resolved. But as regards McCarrick, we need to know exactly what that report revealed, because corruption, when a lid is put on it, it doesn't go away. It festers.
Right. Yeah. When the interviewer asked the Cardinal if the financial corruption at the Vatican went up to the feet of Pope Francis, he offered this.
I mean, the feet of the Pope, we've got Cardinal Pell, the Secretary of State. He's certainly not corrupt. Just how high up it goes is an interesting hypothesis.
Bob, your reaction, it's interesting there. He says Paroline, he's not, he's innocent in this. But Paroline's been involved with some of these disastrous financial issues, including the purchases of those properties in London that made headlines.
Yeah, I noted that too, that he specifically exonerated in a way the Pope and Paroline. But I think it kind of beggars belief that somehow Paroline, who's the second most powerful man in the Vatican, of course, and the Pope himself cannot organize some sort of reform. We've just had the appointment of 2 new inspectors to various Vatican financial organizations, operations. And it looks to many of us as this is just another reshuffling of the cards, because people are fired, new people are brought in, and we never seem to get anywhere when people start to get traction on this corruption.
Right.
And Pell himself is someone, I think, who suffered from this. Suddenly they disappear. So yeah. I don't know how high it goes either. I take Cardinal Pell at his word. He's a very honest and sincere man. Mm-hmm. But if it becomes impossible to believe that the Vatican's finances could be reformed, that would be a very sad day. And it's going to take something much more serious than we've seen, even under this papacy, which has been billed as a reformist papacy. It's going to take something much more serious to succeed in that process.
Yeah, well, I hope that reform takes place. I think we all do, contrary to the narratives that some put out there, Bob. Moving on to the Vatican, there was a lot of news in the quiet of this lockdown, much of which really hasn't gotten a lot of attention. Pope Francis has put together another commission to study women deacons. Now, this is the second time in 4 years that Francis has convened such a commission. Father Jerry, why go through this exercise again? I mean, we saw the results of the last study were inconclusive, if memory serves.
Well, actually, the last study that Pope Francis had authorized, those conclusions were never reported. The report itself that went to the Pope, that is a secret document. We've only gotten media characterizations that since nothing was published, that perhaps it was inconclusive. You know, this will be the third time that the Holy See is studying this matter, because the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith had previously studied this, and they came to the very clear conclusion: there's no historical evidence that this ever existed, and that there's no theological basis in Catholic doctrine to say that the diaconate can be received by women. Now, having a second study commission under the same Pope, I hope they're given the first report so they can, don't have to go over their tracks again. They can read it and then develop arguments. But in my opinion, this is a commission that really should not be formed, simply because the fact of the matter is it casts doubt on whether it's true that women can't be made deacons. Why would you continue to study a matter if the conclusion is that they can't become deacons, that it never happened and it can't possibly happen? So the Pope has his reasons, as you know. The Amazon Synod recommended women deacons or women ministerial roles. So maybe the Pope wants to respond to that with another study and document. But for me, the best answer is the Catholic Church has never ordained a woman a deacon for one reason. The Catholic Church never thought it could do that, and that ends the discussion there.
Bob, the scope of this commission's mandate does not appear to be limited to the early church, as was that 2016 commission. And as Father Jerry said, this seems to be the fruit of the Amazon Synod, calling for an expansion of ministry, including women. Is this a pathway towards ordaining women?
Well, I hope not. I think that what Father just said is absolutely true about the history and about the nature of about the deacons, a deacon is. I think that this particular commission is very curious, though, because some of the more progressive Catholics here in the United States and elsewhere have been outraged by the people who have been named to the commission, some of whom have been outright public critics of the idea of deaconesses. So it is not a strong pro-deaconess committee. And as we know, you can make a committee's outcomes be whatever you want, depending on who the personnel are that you appoint. But in this case, he doesn't seem to have appointed a very strong pro-deaconess slate of commissioners. So I don't know if this is his way of temporizing or keeping engaged the Germans and maybe some people in the Amazon. But as unfortunate as Father rightly says, that he's reappointed a commission to study what has been studied exhaustively and decided, I think as definitively as anything could be. What he's trying to do with this is ambiguous. I'm hoping that what we see by the people who have been selected is that it's going to be dismissed again as an impossibility for the church.
We'll see what the reaction is and how the Germans react. As you mentioned, they're doing their own synodal way, and this is a big part of it, female diaconate and incorporating women in ministry. I want to move on to last week when Pope Francis gave an interview. It was published in Commonweal, and in it he was asked if he saw the crisis, this pandemic, and the economic devastation that it's caused, as a chance for an ecological conversion, for reassessing priorities and lifestyles. And he seemed to frame the pandemic as nature's revenge on an uncaring world. Here's what he said. There is an expression in Spanish, God always forgives. We forgive sometimes, but nature never forgives. We did not respond to the partial catastrophes. Who now speaks of the fires in Australia, or remembers that 18 months ago a boat could cross the North Pole because the glaciers were all melted? Who speaks now of the floods? I don't know if these are the revenge of nature, but they are certainly nature's responses. Your reaction, gentlemen. Father Jerry, you start.
Well, one of the doctrine of the church is that one of the aspects of original sin is that it not only introduced personal sin into the life of Adam and Eve, and then we inherit original sin, but it also introduced disorder into the world. So sickness and death are the fruit of sin. And that is the bigger perspective in which we have to look at this Wuhan coronavirus, which started in China, is now devastating every country in the world. The reality is that this world is passing, and it is a vale of tears, that death is inevitable, and that death can occur precisely when people are not careful. If they're doing research, for instance, there's accusations that a Chinese lab was researching things. Who knows what it is? Right. Certainly, if you're not careful when people get sick and you hide the information, that leads to a widespread transmission of this disease. We have certainly had that. Nature is what it is, and earthquakes and plagues happen. The response of the believing Catholic has to be help those in need. But on the other hand, the greatest spiritual need is for salvation. So prepare people to die well if they're sick and they can't be cured. And in the meantime, provide the hope of the cross. Because remember, things didn't look too good on Good Friday afternoon for the disciples. Mm-hmm. That all changed because eternal life rose from the dead and is now offered to all of us.
Mm-hmm. Bob, your reaction to this, we now have confirmation from U.S. International sources and intelligence sources that this virus was not something of nature, but was man-made and broke out of that lab in Wuhan.
Yeah, I looked very carefully at that statement of the Pope's in that interview with Austin Ivory. And while I would say he doesn't quite connect the virus with those other natural disasters, you could argue that he's suggesting that. I'm glad that he did not connect it directly, because it would be foolish and even kind of reckless to say that a natural evil like a virus is some sort of a revenge of nature or Pachamama, whoever it is that is going to be committing this revenge. God, we know he would say, does not perpetrate revenge on the human race. But look, what we do know, and as you know, Raymond, I've written a whole book on religion and environmentalism, and I follow these issues rather closely. We don't think that the Chinese were trying to create a bioweapon. That may change. At least today, right. The best evidence seems to be that wasn't what they were doing. They might have actually been trying to determine how to deal with coronaviruses, like medical treatments. And somehow it got loose from this lab and then spread worldwide. And the Chinese, of course, didn't tell us exactly what was happening for a long time and still haven't, if the truth be told. But Father is exactly right. The Christian perspective on these things is that nature at least after the fall, is not a perfect realm. It is not the Garden of Eden. So the bad things that happen, I mean, it's not only earthquakes and fires and floods, but it's tsunamis, it's plagues, it's all sorts of things that happen. In moral philosophy, it's always the hardest question to deal with when you're teaching students. Why are these natural evils? And it's a mystery. It's what Augustine calls the mystery of iniquity, mysterium iniquitatis. Mm-hmm. So, look, we could make arguments about what human activity is or is not causing in the world, but the Christian perspective is not to regard natural evils as somehow automatically attributable to, modern capitalist society or whatever the culprit is meant to be. These things, they come from a theological understanding in our view. And we should be cautious about attributing to human beings things that exist because of God's permissive will in the world.
Mm-hmm. Before we run out of time, I want to play something that's a bit more uplifting. Pope Francis called Cardinal Dolan of New York this week to express his concern and love for the people of New York. In a Face the Nation interview last week, Cardinal Dolan had this to say about faith during this trying time.
Just as you have faith that the person you love is still enjoying eternal life and is still with you, so our faith needs to kick in that even if we can't be next to mom and dad or grandma and grandpa, and even if we can't embrace the family at a time of mourning, our faith tells us we're still united, we're still together.
Father Jerry, what was it like to celebrate Easter this year without your parishioners? I mean, it had to be difficult for you personally.
It was a Easter unlike any other, Raymond, because we experienced the communion of the saints. As I was saying Mass at my parish on the side altar of St. Joseph, I was thinking about all the parishioners who ordinarily we'd have Mass at the high altar and they'd be there rejoicing, but they were there spiritually united to their pastor, praying for them. On the other hand, Cardinal Dolan, through his Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral, touched hundreds of thousands of souls in a way that he never would have been able to do, except for this tragedy that's befallen us. And I think that's part of the divine providence. Likewise, I was very encouraged when Pope Francis sent that message, because New York City, where I live, where I'm a pastor, we're the epicenter of the world for this disease. Right now, one of my parishioners' mother is quite ill, and I'm praying for her. I have other parishioners got better after she was ill, but the stories I hear from different people and priests, and, we lost a beloved Monsignor on Staten Island on Holy Thursday. This priest had been the vocation director when I entered the seminary. He was a wonderful priest, Monsignor Richard Guastella, and he was afflicted with the COVID-19 and never came back from the hospital. So, the perspective that I have, which is something I've learned since I was a kid, was this world is not lasting. We are all called to a higher world, which is better, because it's pure joy of happiness with God. So the suffering we undergo now is a preparation for a greater life. And I can't be with all my parishioners on Easter, and it continues, we don't know for how long, but hopefully I'll be with them in heaven, and we can prepare that path right now by praying together.
Yeah, staying together spiritually, at least. I want both of you to quickly react to this before we run out of time. Bishop Peter Baldacchino of Las Cruces, New Mexico, is the first Catholic official to reauthorize the celebration of public masses in the United States. Now, they're limited in New Mexico to 5 participants. He strongly disagreed with his governor's failure to classify religious celebrations as essential services. He says, "It seems to me that while we run a daily count of the physical deaths, we're overlooking those who are dead interiorly." Bob Royal, your response. Should other bishops follow his lead?
I mean, absolutely. If we can have grocery stores open, liquor stores open, other activities that are considered essential. There are many citizens of the United States of America who consider their worship of the Almighty God essential. Now, like in most crisis situations like this, we have to balance the need for a reasonable amount of safety with an openness to returning to worshiping God. But this can be done. We're Americans. You know, we're good at inventing new ways of doing things. You know, someone very early on started to say, maybe we're going to go back to drive-in movies to see movies, or we're going to have drive-in masses. If there's a will to do this, it seems to me that every bishop in the United States, every diocese in the United States, New York is going to be very difficult, obviously, Father, because you are the epicenter in this country, with almost as many deaths as some other entire countries. But we can do this. And by doing this, we can show that we are not only a materialistic people and that all that matters to us is being able to eat and drink and enjoy ourselves, but that our spiritual activity, the debt that we owe to worship God on a weekly basis, at the very least, is something that we can put as a high priority in the United States of America.
Yeah, no. If I can go to a dry cleaner and I can go to the frame shop, you can literally get your frames and matting done. That's an essential service. Surely, an outdoor mass is not going to kill anybody if they're in their car. It's just not going to happen. Father Jerry, your reaction to that also. Today is Pope Benedict XVI, the Pope Emeritus, his 93rd birthday. Your thoughts on that extraordinary milestone of having a retired Pope living in the Vatican with the present Pope, and your reaction to this bishop in New Mexico reopening masses?
Sure. Well, I'll say first to the Pope Benedict, happy birthday, Pope Emeritus. This is one of the greatest theologians, not only of the 20th and 21st century, but of the history of the Church. And his writings are outstanding, right up to his latest writing with Cardinal Sarah about priestly celibacy. So I think I speak on behalf of a lot of priests and Catholics out there that Pope Benedict has been a solid rock of inspiration and defense of the faith, and we're grateful to him for doing that. Now, as regards the Bishop of Las Cruces, he makes a responsible decision based on the information he has. But I'll point out, if you have a limit of 5 people that can be gathered together for a Mass, well, that means the bishop and 4 parishioners. What are you going to do with 100 people waiting at the door? Are you going to have a guard there and the first 4 people get in? In New York City, that would be impractical. I know Cardinal Dolan is very upset that he can't have public masses, but the nature of New York City and other crowded places is, unless you had a large contingent of police and that you were, keeping people blocks away from the door of the church and then sending, we have a limit of 10 here. That was so it'd be the priest and 9 others. You'd have all these people wanting to go to Mass, and it's regrettable. It's akin to wartime. When the Nazis or the communists roll in, we make the sacrifice. We know the priest can't say Mass. Now, this isn't communism or Nazism, but it is a public health crisis, and 100 priests have died in Italy, Raymond. I think of that, I say, this is a tragic, serious thing. It requires tragic and serious response.
Yeah, but a lot of those priests, Father, with due respect, they were going into the wards. They were ministering directly to people who were infected. That's not what we're talking about. And I think we're going to see the CDC lift a lot of these parameters that we've been living under in recent days. The question is, how quickly and how exorbitantly should the Church embrace that freedom? That's going to be the challenge for the bishops. But I'm telling you, I think you would agree. People are eager to get back to the sacraments in some form. Look, I've done my second drive-through confession here. It's not perfect, but the sacrament is at least happening and nobody's, infecting anybody else. I think they have to make those heroic gestures so the people know it's important and it matters. So when this is over, they can return fully to their faith. But we will leave it there. Gentlemen, thank you. Posse, stay safe. You can catch all of Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray's commentary at thecatholicthing.org. Talk to you soon.